Another day, another protest in Quebec, but there's a new debate brewing in the province. Quebec has been called racist by outsiders before, but now there are accusations from inside the province, Quebecers calling out Quebecers. This week, a Montreal area mayor called the new ban ethnic cleansing. Just listen to what he says.
This is an attempt to remove those who practice minority religions, leaving only non-believers and Christians in Quebec. This is ethnic cleansing.
And he wasn't alone. You've got teachers, unions, lawyers. They're all speaking up, saying the old arguments for these kinds of bans no longer hold. And a lot of the pushback is coming from young people using social media to reach out to thousands. We're going to talk to two big players in this debate, a popular radio host who this week was accused of inciting hate by someone in government, and an influential activist who's part of a movement that's been called multicultural extremism. And all of this is driven by Bill 21. It aims to stop public servants like teachers, judges, police officers, all of them from wearing religious symbols at work, like turbans, kippas, and hijabs. Discrete crucifixes are okay. So here's the thing. Crosses and kippas have been around for centuries, and the Quebec government never felt the pressure to bring in a ban on that. So what's changed? Demographics, for one. New legislation in the 1990s led to a surge in French-speaking immigrants, many from Muslim-majority countries like Algeria and Morocco. And look what happened in 2007. The tiny town of Hérouville made international headlines when it introduced a code of conduct, warning immigrants they couldn't stone or burn women or wear veils. The mayor even joked about declaring a state of emergency.
If they ask me not to eat pork, there's a problem. If they ask me not to have Santa Claus, by the way, there's a problem. I don't believe in Santa Claus, but I like it.
The Hérouville Code, it was seen as extreme by a lot of people, but it led to such an emotional debate that the Quebec government formed a province-wide commission to tackle the issue, looking for what it called reasonable accommodation. Two bills were brought in over the next few years, the Charter of Values and the niqab ban. Remember them? Well, they didn't pass, but now there's this new bill, and the poll suggests there's still lots of support for the idea, some as high as 70%. But get this, there is a big generational divide. People under 35 are 15 to 25% less likely to support a ban on religious symbols. They're also a lot less likely to want to reduce immigration to Quebec. So is this a tipping point for Quebec? To understand where the province is now, we're going to take a quick look at the past. In 1951, visible minorities made up less than 1% of Quebec's population, and that included Indigenous people. Fast forward to 2016, and that number rose to 13%. Helps explain the popularity of this film from France, now playing in Quebec.
À Bombay, quel rapport de faire carrière à Bollywood?
The movie's about a nice French family where the four kids choose partners from different backgrounds. It's called What Did I Do to Deserve This? Or in English, Serial Bad Weddings. Yeah, it's a romantic comedy and a hit, and everyone learns to get along. It's kind of like what's happening in Quebec. Traditional values of the older generation colliding with the realities of modern-day life. You could even call this the start of a second quiet revolution. The first one came after what was called La Grande Noirceur, the Great Darkness of the 50s, when Premier Maurice Duplessis ruled with an iron fist. Let's just say Duplessis was beyond old school, and he was backed by the powerful Catholic Church. But then came the 60s and a massive backlash against the church.
It's time for the change.
Women went from having large families, sometimes 15 or more kids, to taking birth control. Feminism exploded. Couples were free to divorce or choose to cohabitate instead of getting married. A lot of people stopped going to church at all. Then came René Lévesque and his Parti Québécois. After his landslide victory in 1976, Lévesque nationalized industries so that now, instead of the church or the English, it was the government setting the rules, a complete separation of church and state. While in much of Canada, the debate is about freedom of religion, in Quebec, it's also been about freedom from religion. Throughout all of this, there's one symbol of the church's stronghold that remains. It's a crucifix, and it's in a critical spot above the Speaker's chair in the National Assembly. The argument's been it's not a religious symbol, it's history. But now the new Quebec government says it's willing to compromise and take that down too. Nowhere is the battle for identity more obvious than with Quebec's version of shock jocks, shows on the radio so provocative they're known as Radio Poubelle or trash radio. They say they're exposing the ugly side of multiculturalism, but critics say they're spreading hate. In 2017, for example, an announcer on one of Quebec City's most popular shows said the Muslim headscarf is just as offensive to him as the swastika. Then, of course, 6 Muslims were shot and killed at a Quebec City mosque, and the tone softened a bit. The Premier at the time, Philippe Couillard, pleaded for more respectful dialogue.
Spoken words matter. Written words matter. They can, of course, express an idea, but they can hurt. They can hurt very much, and we should all be cognizant of that.
At the time, a radio host even apologized on air for not doing his duty, for, he said, denouncing Muslims, but never actually hearing from one on his show. But things haven't changed very much. I'm joined now by another popular shock jock. His name is Eric Duhem. He's in Quebec City. So, hey, Eric, you're a fan. You support this ban against religious symbols in the public service. You're also pushing this petition to keep the crucifix in the National Assembly. Do you see how some people might see that as hypocritical?
Well, I mean, it's not that you have to understand also where Quebec comes from in terms of religion. You know, the religious aspect of Quebec's society has very changed since the Quiet Revolution in the 60s. And a lot of people currently are feeling that, yes, it's part of our history, it's part of our symbols, it's part of, you know, the name of our streets, of our villages, much more than elsewhere in English Canada, for example. They're just asking to make sure that we acknowledge that this is what happened in the past. Our education system, our healthcare system was built, you know, by our priests, by our nuns. I mean, it's part of who we are. They did build those things. We cannot erase our history or take a few pages off our history books. I don't think that kind of revisionism would be great for anyone.
Traditionally, arguments for the ban have been about, you know, Quebec's support for secularism, for feminism. But for some, those arguments aren't playing as strongly as they used to. You have even Quebec Solidaire, the new party, changing its position last weekend, saying it's now against the ban. And increasingly, it's not almost all white francophones that make up Quebec anymore.
No, you're right. And you have to understand one thing also in Quebec. The immigration policies in Quebec have been very different than in the rest of the continent or the rest of the country. As you know, you get points. It's a point system when you get to Quebec. And when you speak French, you have much more points. So our immigration has changed drastically over the last few years. And it's not as diverse maybe as it could be in English Canada. And the thing is that when you get, you know, a few communities from only a few countries, you know, they stick together and it gets much more difficult to integrate within Quebec society. And there's a risk of having ghettos, and which is nobody's hoping on one side or the other. So there's also that fact that could be a little bit different in Quebec than in the rest of the country.
On your show, you talk a lot about what you call radical Islam. You saying things like the Quran says it's okay to beat your wife if she disobeys you, that Islam is trying to dominate the planet. I mean, it really does sound like you're trying to provoke. You've actually been accused publicly of inciting hatred.
You know, it's a very emotional debate. As I said, it's been going on for years and years and years in Quebec. We've been around all of those debates. Now, I don't see, you know, the opposition is not surprised. The people, we find something that it's very consensual.
But it doesn't sound like you're seeking consensus. It kind of sounds like you're trying to make people think badly of Muslim people.
I'm sorry to tell you, but you know what when the things we're talking about, a very strong majority of Quebecers agree with it. Actually, those who are maybe more radical are the multiculturalists right now in Quebec, that their message is not resonating. The main party that has been promoting multiculturalism in Quebec, the Quebec Liberal Party, is now at 10% among francophones, Wendy, and I can tell you that their position on the ban is not an accident. I mean, they're getting disconnected with French Quebec right now.
But I just wondered, you know, do you ever have any moments late at night where you kind of go, should I be worried here? Is there any way that I may be making things worse? Do you ever think that?
You know, when you're the media and you're a pundit and you're expressing you're on talk radio, you have views and you're expressing your opinion, and there's people who like it, people who don't, and this is what democracy is all about, and this is what freedom of expression is all about, and this is how we have debates in a normal society.
Eric Duhem, it's been great to hear your point of view, and thanks so much for talking to me.
It's been a pleasure, thank you.
Eric Duhem in Quebec City. And joining me from Montreal to talk about this issue from another side of the debate is a writer and activist named Idil Issa. So, Idil, you just heard Eric Duhem say that he's not anti-Muslim, he just is respecting Quebec's past. Hearing that, is it hurtful?
Definitely, because I consider myself a Quebecer, I consider myself a Canadian, and I consider myself fully integrated into this society. I mean, if you take myself as an example, I was the valedictorian, you know, I went to McGill, I checked all the boxes, which so many religious minorities do in efforts to be exemplary citizens and to contribute to society. And it's a shame where our government is really putting into place laws which will prevent us from contributing to society. So yes, it is hurtful.
The polls seem to suggest that there's a divide between young Quebecers and not so young Quebecers. Is that something that you see? Do young Quebecers think differently?
Well, recently, Québec Solidaire, which is a provincial party here in Quebec, had a very important vote on this bill, whether to support it or not, and roughly 95% of their members voted against supporting this bill. It's a very young party, so I think maybe some of that generational divide we can see in positions like the one that's being taken by Québec Solidaire. So yes, I do think there's a generational divide. You know, some things that previous generations have lived through, maybe some younger generations in Quebec don't have as close an experience with.
Is Quebec changing?
I do believe it is. Slowly but surely, I think it is. The Québec Solidaire decision shows that it is changing. Younger people in Quebec who will, you know, be the future of this province have different opinions and different positions than maybe some of the older generations. But I think what we've seen recently is there's been a huge pushback from civil society with many major organizations, including the FFQ, Fédération des Femmes du Québec, Quebec's largest women's organization, many unions as well, the CSN, and other very important civil society groups coming out en masse against this proposed bill.
Are you saying that Quebec is more racist or more xenophobic than any other province, any other part of Canada?
Definitely not. I think these currents are always at play within any society. So I think that it behooves the rest of Canada not to look at what's going on in Quebec through a holier-than-thou lens, but to really activate in service of our most cherished values, namely the rights that we have enshrined in our various charters.